was in many ways not a difficult one. And to help you understand that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the university had been through that pretty much made taking the pledge after we'd been through that process and of course kind of a moment. It really was the Can't Buy My Silence movement really gave Kings access to a ready mechanism to codify values of openness and transparency and of accountability that Kings had put into practice in making amends to a number of former students who were found by an independent review to have been sexually harmed by a professor who was then retired but was a member of the faculty when these harms had been committed. So from that experience, and I speak holistically of Kings, respecting and acknowledging there's a whole range of opinions within our community, but at an institutional level, we know from the history that we have lived and its continuing legacy that cloaking sexualized violence in secrecy causes pervasive damage to the victims of that violence. And I've had that communicated to me in one-on-one conversations with the men who came forward about this professor at King's. And it also causes fundamental damage to the ability of everyone to trust the institution or the community that has done that cloaking. And I heard that voluminously from King's alumnus when this story finally broke in the press about how, from their point of view, the university had never done anything when it had previous opportunities to do something about this individual. And that taught me that however good and strong the relevant sexualized violence policy may be, an institution that has created or tolerated a shroud of secrecy around sexualized violence will not be trusted not to do so again. I'm going to go back just a little bit because the response of the university to the allegations that came forward against Dr. Wayne Hankey have a very important background. And there's a devoted group of people at King's. I found them in place when I became president in 2016, who have both pushed the university and helped the university to be accountable for past mistakes, to make reparations, and to protect our community moving forward. And at the forefront of that group of people are King's students who demanded a policy to create much greater awareness of sexualized violence, to prevent it and to respond to it, and a policy that was victim-centered. And it's very important to emphasize that at King's, I'm talking about a period from about 2015 to 2018, that students were not simply one part of the policy development process. Although faculty were involved, staff were involved, alumni were involved, the board was involved. King's students actually drafted the first version of our policy. And I think that's very, very significant. And then in 2019, we hired Jordan as our sexual health and safety officer. Again, in response overwhelmingly to the dedicated, and I would say unequivocal advocacy of King's students, that we have a full-time dedicated sexual health and safety officer. And Jordan very quickly became a trusted campus presence who everyone at King's consults on every decision made to do with the implementation of the policy, as well as overseeing the implementation of the policy. And we were one of the first universities in Nova Scotia, I believe, to have a Jordan. Right? So the Board of Governors approved the new policy 2018. And although it didn't deal with the question of NDAs, which is not surprising, policies, given everything we've just heard, tend not to do that. It was created to protect victims and respect their confidentiality. And it was intended to be the foundations of what we now at King's call a culture of consent and respect. And this policy has been crucial in our efforts to belatedly address some difficult parts of our history. And it's the background to our decision to sign on to the Can't Buy My Silence pledge. So in February of 2021, criminal charges were laid against a retired King's Carnegie professor, and that categorization means this individual was also a faculty member at Dalhousie. And that was, those charges were based on one count of sexual assault from an incident in 1988. So the scope of the charges against that person later broadened to include other accusations and additional charges from the late 1970s up to 1998. So the day after the charges became public, that was an intense 24 hours with lots of advice from some very good people, Jordan, but also I really want to give credit to a group of people who were working with me and helping me. I released a statement committing King's to an independent review of the matter. And in the following month, and this is important, I think after consultations with the executive of the King's Student Union, faculty representatives, the executive of the board, and the executive of the Alumni Association, King's announced that we had appointed Toronto lawyer Janice Rubin to conduct the independent review. And Janice actually met independently with those groups, independently from me. So the professor in question died about a year later in February of 2022, shortly before the first criminal trial was supposed to start. The Crown almost immediately dismissed the charges, and I almost as quickly announced that the review would continue, saying that it was never about criminal responsibility, but about our responsibilities and accountability as a university. So the review resulted in 2 separate reports, each corresponding to 2 separate parts of Janice's mandate. The first part of the report, released in May of 2022, evaluated that 2018 King's policy, and it evaluated it as strong and of high quality. And not surprisingly, because King's students have played a fundamental role in bringing it into existence. And it also included recommendations for improvement that became the action plan that we now use to guide what we're doing at King's, called Towards a Culture of Consent and Respect. And the places really strong emphasis on education and prevention. That same month, I had the opportunity to speak with Julie McFarland, who was attending her daughter's King's graduation. And Julie did not miss the opportunity. So Julie urged me to consider making King's one of the very first Canadian universities to take the pledge. And I'm grateful for that conversation and the follow-up conversations that you've had with your colleagues, with Jordan and I. So in February of 2023, I met Janice Rubin to discuss her second and final report, the one in which she concluded that multiple King's students had been harmed, and that King's had both failed in preventing the harm when it could have been prevented, and in holding the professor in question accountable. And Janice urged me to reach out to the men who had been subjected to predatory and abusive behavior, and I did so, meeting individually with all who were ready to meet with me. I apologized to each one of them for what was done to them and for the university's failure to protect them. And each one of them had wonderful suggestions for me about how I should make the public apology that they and I knew would be one of Janice's recommendations. So on March 15th of 2023, that's a day that's etched in memory, we released the final report to the community, the press, and the public. And I made a public apology and announced that we were accepting all the report's recommendations, including a key recommendation on making amends by settling legal actions and avoiding litigation, because that would cause additional harm. So shortly after, I received a financial mandate from the Board of Governors to settle all claims, knowing we had no insurance coverage for some and inadequate insurance coverage for others. And at that time, I advised the board that we would not be asking for any non-disclosure agreements from the claimants. And I'll just pause and say, because then I felt like I knew these men. And I didn't have any broad philosophical position on NDAs. I didn't know many of the things that you shared tonight, but I did know those men. And we did not want to ask for non-disclosure agreements, especially in light of the history of secrecy. And I'm happy to say the board unanimously endorsed that decision. And so by September of 2023, we had settled all claims without demanding any NDAs. So in the fall of 2023, Jordan and I sought approval from the board to sign the pledge with Acadia. And I'm very grateful for Acadia reaching out to Kings and suggesting that we do this together. And it was not an extensive discussion. Jordan and I and our board were all on the same page. On the one hand, how could we not take the pledge, given what we had been through and what we had learned from what we had been through, and especially what we had learned from the men who had come forward and the harm that had been done to them. On the other hand, we agreed that the pledge would help to ensure that Kings would never use an NDA to do what it had done in 1990, which is the date when these matters were previously considered, which was to bury sexualized violence and the abuse of power that caused such terrible harm to those abused and to the ability of generations of students to be proud of their university and confident of its commitment to their safety. I just want to briefly acknowledge Doug Ruck, the chair of our board, and our board of governors, who were truly amazing through this whole process. So really the pledge for us was an opportunity for us to codify the values that were in our policy that we had put into practice in responding to these criminal charges and doing the best we could to resolve the harm that had been caused. I just want to end with 2 points, if that's okay. I may be talking too long. First, it's important for me to say that prior to the charges being laid, I had failed in my own responsibilities to challenge the continuing celebration of this professor, including standing by while his portrait was hung in the college library, in all places in the students' reading room. I acknowledge this in my public apology, and I think it's important to mention this here to avoid giving the impression that my own piece in this story is only about doing the right thing, because I sometimes haven't. And second, I want to end by acknowledging the members of the King's community who persisted in telling their story, even when the university had failed to protect them and multiple times failed to believe them. King's owes them a deep debt of gratitude. In speaking up, they initiated a painful but essential process that has facilitated meaningful change and is helping to make King's a better, safer, and more trustworthy place. I sincerely hope it has also helped in their own healing. I thank them for having the courage to speak up and trusting us with their experiences. Of course, it's our responsibilities to earn and keep that trust on a continuing basis. The impact they have had on Kings, and thanks to the pledge, the impact they will continue to have, illustrates the change in the world that victims of sexualized violence can have if they are not silenced by NDAs. Thanks for listening.